The Trump administration is billing you, the taxpayer, for Vice President Mike Pence's stay at a Trump property in Ireland, all thanks to a heavy-handed suggestion from President Trump. This chance to take dollars from the U.S. Treasury and put them in Trump's pockets looks especially desperate tonight because the golf club in question is a whopping 180 miles away from Pence's government meetings, which is a bit like getting a hotel in Boston to go to a government meeting in New York. And all this comes after Trump lobbied for the G7 summit to use his struggling Doral Resort in Florida for its next meeting. This is not normal. It's also not what Donald Trump promised in his, do you remember this, very first press conference as president-elect when he claimed he would be hands-off management and his sons would take his businesses and run them professionally.
My two sons, who are right here, Don and Eric, are going to be running the company. They are going to be running it in a very professional manner. They're not going to discuss it with me. These papers are just some of the many documents that I've signed, turning over complete and total control.
Now, tonight, the blowback on Donald Trump's latest efforts to subsidize his own companies is actually strong enough that Vice President Mike Pence is out on defense.
The opportunity to stay at Trump National in Doonbeg to accommodate the unique footprint that comes with our security detail and other personnel made it logical.
That unique footprint, as we're reporting to you tonight, includes 180 miles of footprint, and that's why this is obviously illogical, even kind of embarrassingly so. Pence doesn't have any better arguments, and he's not alone in what he's up to. Have you heard about this yet? Attorney General Barr now plowing $30,000 into a lavish holiday party at Donald Trump's D.C. hotel. And the career official who actually ran the ethics department during the Trump administration earlier last year says all of this is sending signals that Barr's loyalty is to Trump and not to the country. We turn now to an ethics guru you may recognize, the one and only Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics attorney under the Republican administration of George W. Bush. First of all, nice to have you back, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be back with you.
Yes, sir. This is not normal. The arguments that Mr. Pence is making don't pass any kind of test, as we just showed. And the things that Mr. Barr is doing, while not, again, technically illegal, do appear to be basically blinking red ethics violations. How does this compare to anything you saw in your tenure in government, and what should be done about it?
It's outrageous. And indeed, I think it's illegal. I think the whole thing is illegal. Let's start with the vice president's stay. The United States taxpayer is paying for that. The federal government is going to make a big outlay in order to promote the Trump Hotel. Trump will make money when Secret Service agents stay there. Also, the promotion value. Our money is being used to promote his hotel. This is a violation of the Domestic Emoluments Clause, which caps the president's compensation for his services at his compensation set by Congress. He is not entitled to milk the taxpayer right, left, and center, and that's what he's doing here. This is illegal as well as immoral and illogical. Attorney General Barr, now he's...
Well, let me, we'll get to Barr.
Let me... Yeah.
I've got a slight tape delay, my fault, but I want to get to Barr. Let me play for you a little more from what I do think is an important test for everyone to remember, which is Donald Trump isn't only failing the ethics test, he's obviously failing the promises he made in his very first press conference as president-elect when he had his money on his mind. Take a look.
I could actually run my business. I could actually run my business and run government at the same time. I don't like the way that looks, but I would be able to do that if I wanted to. I'd be the only one that would be able to do that. You can't do that in any other capacity. But as a president, I could run the Trump Organization, great company, and I could run the company, the country. I do a very good job, but I don't want to do that.
Richard, your response to that by today's facts and what you wanted to get in about Mr. Barr.
Well, that's exactly what he's doing. He's running the Trump Organization. He's trying to make the Trump Organization richer, and he's using his official position as President of the United States to do that. And he is enriching himself in violation of the Constitution, which restricts his compensation. He has no right to do that with our money. Attorney General Barr is using his own money, so it's not a taxpayer issue, but there's a gift rule. You're not allowed to give a gift to your superior in the government worth more than $10. You can't take your boss out to lunch unless the lunch costs less than $10. Attorney General Barr is going to spend $30,000 at a Trump hotel having his so-called holiday party where he invites his rich friends to schmooze people in the Trump administration, whoever else there is. That's a $30,000 outlay, and you could bet the profits on that are a lot more than $10. That's going right in the back pocket of Donald Trump. That's a violation of the gift rules. And the Attorney General of the United States is the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the United States. He should be ashamed of himself. He should resign for having even suggested that, and Donald Trump shouldn't take the gift.
Tough words on some issues that are really out here wide open. I mean, brazenly wide open. Richard Painter, always appreciate your perspective on the program, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll have you back. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.